Dawn has finally arisen from her bed. To welcome the new day, Zeus sends the goddess Strife into the Achaean camp, and the goddess releases a high-pitched cry, great and terrible, that drives the Achaeans mad for war and struggle. Agamemnon rallies the Achaeans and Hector the Trojans as Zeus rains blood from the sky, and Strife continues her wild groans. Following Diomedes' advice to fight on the front lines, Agamemnon leads the Argives on a bloody warpath against the Trojans. Agamemnon slaughters his enemies, including one Trojan who Agamemnon cuts off his head and arms, and as Homer says, sends him rolling through the carnage like a log. So wonderful. Just a wonderful image. Read the great books, everybody. Zeus sends Iris to tell Hector to stay off the front lines and to command his men from the back until Agamemnon is wounded. Then Zeus will bless Hector and lead a counteroffensive all the way back to the Achaean ships. After Agamemnon is wounded and retreats, Hector pushes the Achaeans all the way back to the rampart. One by one, the Achaean warlords are injured and retreat. Diomedes, Odysseus, and Machaon, the healer, are all injured and retreat. Great Ajax desires to hold his ground, but is forced to retreat by Zeus. Still by his ship, Achilles watches the onslaught and tells Patroclus he thinks the Achaeans are ready to grovel at his knees. Achilles sends Patroclus to Nestor for advice, and Nestor tells Patroclus that Achilles should at least let Patroclus lead the Myrmidons into battle wearing Achilles' armor. Patroclus leaves to return to Achilles, but stops to assist an Achaean suffering from an arrow wound. The book ends with Patroclus caring for his fellow soldier, and the foretold doom of Zeus about the body of Patroclus inches closer.
Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast, where the glory of our day is to spend it with you, reading the Iliad as we work through Homer in a year.
Book 11.
Book 11.
Agamemnon's Day of Glory. Which is actually, I will say, the titles of the books come from Fagles, the translator that we're kind of working through. Again, highly recommended. This is the only one I've found so far that I actually don't think quite meets the text. If that makes sense.
Okay.
I mean, it is like Agamemnon's, I guess. I mean, he's on the front lines. We should notice, by the way, that going back a few books, he's following Diomedes' advice. Remember when Achilles won't come back and fight, Diomedes says, hey, why don't you fight on the front lines tomorrow? Then we had a whole book about what happens at night. Now it's the morning, and Agamemnon's doing just that, which is, kudos to him. He's leading, etc. That's fine. But it really strikes me like the chapter should be called like the Fall of the Achaeans or something, because all the warlords, the main warlords, right, become injured. Diomedes, Odysseus, their healer, Agamemnon, like Ajax is forced to retreat. So, I mean, this is a full-bore retreat back under Hector. And then book 12 is just decimating. So it's interesting. It's just something to note that it's I would characterize the book slightly different. So
I agree. I don't think I disagree there.
All right, so let's kind of look through this. It's a long book, but it's a somewhat straightforward book because it's mainly tracking the warfare, right? So Dawn finally comes. She rises from her bed. We get Agamemnon. We kind of get a long passage of him getting ready for battle. Again, we have to somewhat jettison the classical Greek armor from our minds. It talks about, right, that his armor, his helm has like twin horns with a hair crest, a horse hair crest on top. Like there's some things that would be familiar to us and some things that very much, would not be, like the tassels, the colors, the horns on the helmets, etc.
Yeah, as I was reading this for the first time, I thought like, okay, this is the momentum building, right? This is where the momentum shifts. We're ramping up. We're building up. That Agamemnon's finally being a king, finally doing what he's supposed to be doing, getting ready for battle. This is where I think the momentum kind of shifts.
And Zeus is kind of showing his like true kind of butchery side, right? Because today is going to be brutal. Because basically you're going to have, as we mentioned in the narrative opening, Agamemnon's going to push the Trojans away from the ships, all the way pretty much back to Troy. And then Hector's going to turn around and slaughter the Argives all the way back to their wall or their rampart, right, that they have built. Because we keep in mind, because this could be confusing, keep in mind that when the Achaeans were supposed to be building their funeral pyres for the dead, they also built a rampart.
Which they weren't supposed to be doing.
Which was somewhat, tricky on their part. Are you like playing with your microphone?
I'm just checking something out.
Okay, yeah, more power to you.
Yeah.
So keep in mind then, both sides technically have a wall, right? Mm-hmm. So the Trojans have their wall that was built by...
This didn't work as well as what I thought it was going to.
That's fine. You just keep fiddling with your mic. I'll do the podcast. Don't worry about it.
Very good.
So the Trojans have their own wall, and so do the Achaeans now. They have this kind of rampart with a big moat, or not a moat, a ditch, a trench in front of it, right? Which will play a large part in Book 12. So let's see. So Agamemnon, he's just slaughtering people, right? He's going left and right. He's leading the way. There's a wonderful...
Why does this not... Like, if Agamemnon is such the warrior that this book portrays, why is he always messing things up? Like, why does he not, want to fight? Why does he not... To me, when I was reading this, I was like, man, if he's such a badass here, why is he not doing this more often?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to tell about, right? He seems to have... a reputation, I think, of not being on the front lines, right, of fighting from the back, right. So it's unclear, how much of the Argives actually seen Agamemnon lead from the front, right? So here we see him doing it. Is he good? Is he just blessed by Zeus, right? Because this is Zeus's will to lead them up and then have them all get knocked down. It's up for debate. There's a good around 130. There's just a wonderful imagery. Again, I mentioned last week when we looked at book 10, Homer's going to engage in a lot of animal imagery, right? A lot of similes here. And this is one with Agamemnon, right? He's like the lion mauling the soft, weak, young, running deer, clamping in his massive jaws, cracks their backbones with a snap. Right. Right. And it just goes on and on and on. It's actually a very long, metaphor that he gives.
Over 10 lines.
But he gives, it certainly paints, a picture. So, he's slaughtering these people. We already mentioned the narrative. I had to put it in the narrative because I could not resist this guy that goes rolling through the carnage like a log, right? He cuts off his head and arms. It's just, I could not resist. I was like, maybe I should just mention this as an aside. No, I'm going to put it in the narrative, right? This is a really important part. Read the great books, everybody. Right. So that's 170. That we get that wonderful...
Yeah. How did I not... I did not...
You missed that?
Yeah. Well, I didn't miss it, but for some reason I did not...
Well, you got to mark that up, put an asterisk next to it.
Yeah.
Be like, honey, what did you learn reading the Iliad today? Well, let me tell you.
Yeah. Some dude went rolling down like a log.
Right. In a terrible way. So, let's see. So then what we get then is Zeus, the Trojan retreat... Zeus then sends Iris, right, to go tell Hector, basically hey, hang out in the back, command from the back, don't engage Agamemnon until he's wounded and retreats, and then I will bless you, and you can go all the way, basically push the Argives all the way back to the ships. And Hector does this. This is at 2:20 is when he's told by Iris, and then Hector obeys. I don't know how you read this. Sometimes when I'm reading it, before I even see how things play out, I make a little note of maybe what I think might happen, right? Or just what my expectation is. Mm-hmm.
And when I do that, I end up making all these notes about dudes who die immediately.
I think this guy will be a main character. Yeah. He's gonna change the war. Then he rolls like a log, right? Yeah. Or he gets I can't remember what book it is, but we'll get to it where you see these things online, and maybe we should do one. They're kind of fun. It's like top 10 brutal deaths in the Iliad, right? Not exactly like the highbrow, great books, perennial truths that we're seeking, but it's kind of fun. And particularly if you're trying to get, adolescent boys to read the Iliad, right? Mm-hmm. This is a good first text for multiple reasons. And we really had Pandarus, right? Who, remember, he gets speared like through the air. We got another guy that got speared through the bladder, and it sounded terrible.
Oh man, yeah. And like 13, there's several of like brutal deaths.
I can't remember. Just like as an example, like if there's 10 brutal deaths, like 8 of the 10 are all in the same book. Like all of a sudden, everyone who gets speared can't just get speared in the chest.
Right.
Yeah, get speared through your left eye, and it comes out your mouth while you're crying for your mother. Like it's like whatever.
Yeah.
So anyway, one of the things though I noticed here was I make these little notes. Is I really thought Hector might balk at this, right? Like because remember when he talked to his wife. Right, she was like, "Hey, why don't you command from the walls?" Or like, and he gives this kind of like wonderful speech, bravado of, maybe bravado is probably too negative, probably fortitude, a virtue of like, "Hey, I need to be on the front lines with my men." Mm-hmm. So I actually kind of thought that he would maybe balk at this a bit, or argue, or do something, and he really doesn't. He really acquiesces. From a pro Hector side, you could say, he knows the voice of the gods. He's incredibly pious. Mm-hmm. He'll obey without, pushing back too much. If you're going to be negative on Hector, you could say, "Hey, remember Sarpedon? Remember, right. He's been critiqued for this. He's actually already been critiqued for hanging out towards the back. Mm-hmm. So maybe this is a temptation he's more than glad to give into." We don't get a whole lot. I mean, it's not really parsed out for us, but how Hector receives this command from Zeus to hang out in the back when he's usually on the front lines, and really has actually, I think, been on the front lines since that critique, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you kind of critiqued him last time for some of his military prudence and some tactics, but he's been on the front lines, fighting.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it was kind of shocking last one. I also think it was interesting that Iris, as he's talking to Hector, he says, and this is what, probably line 232, 233, he says, "Hector, son of Priam, a mastermind like Zeus."
Yeah, there's that epithet.
Which I thought was interesting, because that's typically, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that typically Odysseus' title that is given to him?
It is, yeah.
And so, he goes on, Iris is telling Hector basically when to attack, but I just thought that was interesting because, and again, maybe I'm wrong, and I am happy to be wrong, or be corrected, I guess. I'm not happy about being wrong. I'm happy to be corrected, if need be. Typically, Hector is not referenced as a mastermind like Zeus.
No, it's not exclusively for Odysseus, but I do think that is actually something that is notable. I mean, that epithet itself, I think, is worth tracking. Right. Why is this used, et cetera?
Yeah. And then, maybe I'm jumping ahead, so we can backpedal if you'd like, but 255, it is the invocation of muses. And this is maybe like a handful of times that the invocation of muses has happened.
Yeah, so this is, the one thing I went back there to look real fast, and I don't know if I misheard you or not, but Iris is interested, she's a goddess, and she plays a big part in the Iliad, and then she drifts off in Greek mythology, and actually Hermes basically takes her role, right? So she's the messenger goddess, she goes back and forth, and then later as mythology develops, Hermes takes her place, right? So just kind of where I didn't recall if she was a god or goddess, so I had to look real fast. Sorry, that's what I was doing. The muses. So this is, again, an invocation to the muses, and that should call our attention, right? So he does it, I think this is the 4th, if I counted it up, I talked about it in the guide. I believe this is the 4th invocation. You get once at the beginning of the Iliad, and then you get 3 times when he's listing all of the Achaean tribes that have come, which really is focusing a lot on like that Greek unity, right? Look, we all can come together, right? They're city-states, we're constantly at war with each other. Look, we've been able to come together as a people, right? Nation's probably an anachronistic word here, but to come together as a group. So this is the 4th invocation, and it's kind of striking that it is it's about Agamemnon. It's about Agamemnon, going up against the Trojans. And it's interesting that this merits that invocation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure, maybe as the Iliad develops, we see why is this a moment that he needs to invoke the Muses, right? Like, is this a pivot? In retrospect, will we see like, oh, this was like the turning point for something?
Mm-hmm.
I think in book 11, and I'm happy to, be critiqued here, but I didn't see it, I found it misplaced. Right, or at least my initial reading, which maybe is too surface level, I didn't see like why would this be that would merit this? Because the first one you're like, okay, we're telling about the rage of Achilles, right? This we're telling the whole story.
Right.
The third ones, I think those can also throw people for a loop. Like, why are we talking about the Muses, invoking him 3 times when just this terrible chapter, right? Book 2. That's like, has all the charm of reading a genealogy from the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so that one you can have an insight and say, well, actually, I think it's Greek unity that merits that. So I think this is something we should track and see if we can kind of discover why would this moment be one to invoke the Muses. So Agamemnon moves on. We get a lot of who he stabs and things like this. 279, we got a new little phrase for someone dying. He slept the sleep of bronze. I don't think I've seen that one this far, right? I liked all the like he loosed his limbs, or he fell down into the blackness, or the mist covered his eyes.
Right.
When you tell an epic story and a lot of people die, you've got to come up with interesting ways to phrase it. And I don't think we've seen that one, right? He dropped him and he slept the sleep of bronze. So
I like that.
Anyway, so Agamemnon's slaughtering, and then Agamemnon is wounded, right? And he just starts to retreat. So at 3:30, we get Hector's signal, right? And he says, Zeus is handing me glory, awesome glory. And so he rallies the Trojans. We get, again, a lot of this animalistic imagery. He's once again compared to Ares. This is like 345 or so. If you remember, like there was a period of time there he would be compared to Ares a lot. So that imagery comes back. Then we get, kind of get these Odysseus and Diomedes, right? So what do they do,
team.
right? Our little Athena tag team comes in here. So they're fighting, right? And then Hector, this is around like 400, right? He sees Diomedes. Diomedes actually shuddered to see him coming on, and the Lord of the war cry called out to Odysseus. And it's interesting, Diomedes, says, we're in for a shipwreck, a breaker rolling down on us. Look at massive Hector, brace for him. But then Diomedes turns around and chunks his spear and hits Hector right in the head.
Right.
So I think,
a gift from Apollo that his helmet blocked it.
So I think there's a few things happening here. One, I think Diomedes is still, I think the one way to read this is that he's not afraid. Well, I would say he's not a coward. I think he still has the capacity to see when people are being blessed by the gods, right? He's kind of been the one that's been sensitive to that throughout the poem. And I think Diomedes realizes that the favor of Zeus has shifted.
Right? That's the only read that I took of this, because here we have him, it seems like, almost worried about Hector, who has basically almost died because of Ajax. We've seen several times. And Diomedes, I think Ajax is a stud warrior, but Diomedes, in the book at least, has slaughtered a lot of men. Like, just goes on these bloodlusts, of rampages. So I don't see Diomedes being too afraid or worried about really anybody. And then all of a sudden, he sees Hector, this massive Hector.
Yeah.
So I think the only read that I took of this was Diomedes was attuned that the gods were playing in their favor.
Yeah, I think that's a fair read. But even in that, Diomedes, which we've seen him do several times, he tends to tempt this, right?
Well, he always this is on brand for him, right?
Yeah.
He what else havoc can I cause? Or he always dips his toe in just to see if he can maybe change the outcome a little bit, and then realizes, nope, I can't, or he does.
Yeah, and he tends to do this, right? So he sees something, but he's still going to play with fate a bit. So the other thing too here is that one of the things that we've been tracking, and we talked about an interesting hypothetical one time, which was if you took away kind of all the divine assistance, if you will, from the armies, like who would win?
I think it's very clear.
To whom?
I don't think the Trojans would win.
Yeah, I think that's the right read, and I think I actually would argue, or I guess I would want to argue, I'd want to push back, I'd want to have a conversation on, is that it seems very clear to me that the Argives would still win against the Trojan army, even if they did not have Achilles.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, at least Homer has not led us to believe that the Trojans have very many grandiose warriors.
Right. And also that's another thing is that Aeneas has been really silent.
Where's he been?
Yeah, where has he been? So one of the things that I pointed out here, or one of the things that I think it merits being pointed out, it's notable, is just like, here's another part. Now, it's not that the gods come in and save him, but it's a gift from Apollo that has saved him, right? And Diomedes realizes that Apollo has pulled him through, right? Diomedes comments on this. But here's another section where Hector would have died. I mean, he gets hit in the head of the spear. It doesn't pierce his helmet, but then he actually goes down because the world goes black across his eyes. Right?
When I first read this, I was like, no, he didn't die. Like
Hector just dies halfway through the book.
Right, I was like, no, that can't be.
Surprise!
I've seen the documentary. Okay,
right, I've watched
this
it.
Is not how he dies.
So then our boy Paris comes up, right? And I just love this. So Paris comes out and shoots Diomedes, and he shoots Diomedes in the foot, the flat top of the right foot, right? And I love how Homer describes this. He says, this is like 445. He says, and loosing a heady laugh of triumph, Paris leapt from his hiding place and shouted out in glory, right? I mean, just really, you mentioned being on brand.
Right? He is. I love to hate him.
And this is really, I mean, this is a two ends of the spectrum, right? I mean, here's Diomedes, who's this grand warrior. Lots of Trojans have died under his spear, his sword, and now here's Paris. And Diomedes basically points this out, right? So brave with your bow and arrows, big bravado, glistening love locks, roving eye for girls. And skip down a bit. A woman or an idiot boy could wound me so. The shaft of good-for-nothing cowards got no point, but mine's got heft and edge, right? So now, but Diomedes is injured, right? And he's actually racked with pain. So he's out. So we're starting to see the fall of the Achaeans. And then all of a sudden, Odysseus then is on his own. And this is the one that I kind of wanted to foreshadow last time we spoke on book 10, when we look at Diomedes and Odysseus and say, hey, are these two guys like reflecting the two aspects of Athena, this kind of like tactics and strategy versus like this military power? We've seen Diomedes play both roles, right? Both like military strength, but also counselor. And some of the questions we raised was like, wait, well, we've seen Odysseus be tactics, but have we seen him really be warrior? Because even when they did the like marauding through the night, Diomedes did all the work, right? Odysseus was back advising. So here, there's no more tactics. Odysseus gets left by his own. He prays the Zeus for strength. And Homer talks about him, this is like 490 or so, right? He ends up being like a wild boar surrounded by hunters. So he's actually surrounded by these Trojan, these Trojan warriors. And it's quite notable, not only that he hasn't retreated, but also he lunges first, right? This is like somewhere like 495. He lunges first and actually knocks one of these guys down.
Odysseus then is hit in the ribs.
Right.
So
kind of a nasty hit, right? Flayed the skin clean off Odysseus's ribs.
Right. So another one bites the dust here. I mean, it just one's falling. They're falling like flies here.
So, yeah, and Odysseus is saved by Athena, which is somewhat notable. So then Menelaus hears Odysseus's cries for help. Menelaus and Ajax are quick to respond.
Good old Ajax. He's just like a good, like one of those guys who you always want in your group, knowing that he's kind of like one of those you're at a party or something like that. He has no idea what's going on, but he's going to be backing you up regardless. It doesn't matter what the situation is. He's gonna stand up for you.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, Ajax is one of my favorite characters in the Iliad, and just maybe as like a preliminary, maybe kind of like a more raw take. He tends to strike me as the closest thing we get to just a naturally good warrior. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is like, obviously like Hector, Diomedes, Achilles, they tend to just wane, like there's this ebb and flow. Are they blessed by the gods? Are they not blessed by the gods, et cetera? Ajax in a lot of ways tends to present just like a natural prowess of being a warrior. And if I remember correctly, right at the beginning, he's actually listed as the second most talented warrior on the Achaean side. It's not Diomedes, it's actually Ajax that's under Achilles. And also the other thing, I just love the imagery here. He's a giant man. He carries this tower shield, right? So everyone else kind of has these round shields, and he's carrying this towering, almost full body shield. What is it, like 8 ox hides thick or something, right?
Right.
And it's always like, he always has this wonderful imagery that and maybe it's more of like me and my imagination, having a veneer on it, but where he just like runs and just smashes this shield down and whoever he's trying to protect, right? So it's just like he comes in and it always says he plants it, right? Mm-hmm. So he runs and he plants it right in front of the guy to protect him, and then is able to like pull him back, right? And Ajax is, again, interesting here is that Ajax, I guess we'll get there to have some discipline. So Ajax is jumping in.
Starts dominating him.
Right.
Really.
Our boy Paris comes back in. So let's just keep this in mind. Paris has shot, let's see, who has he shot? He shot a horse, all right? He has shot Diomedes in the foot, and now he shoots their medic.
Right.
Right? He shoots their healer. So this is 595 or so. If Paris, the lord of lovely fair-haired Helen, had not put a stop to Macion's gallant fighting, striking the healer squarely with an arrow. Right, so now he shoots their medic. And
in the shoulder.
Right, and they have to pull him back, right? Because they say he's worth, somewhere in here they say like, he's worth an entire army by himself, right? Mm-hmm. They've got to make sure that he's safe.
Good old Nestor, always willing to help, comes in and helps.
Yep. And Ajax then, right, does not want to retreat. Ajax is basically like, it's really interesting. So keep this in mind, like Hector is blessed by Zeus. Hector's supposed to be leading a counteroffensive against the Achaeans. And look at line, what is this?
635 or so?
Yeah, 638. Hector is leading this onslaught against the Argives, and here comes Ajax, right, who's really refusing to retreat and is leading a counteroffensive. And Hector, quote, stayed clear of attacking Ajax man to man.
A little PSTD or?
Yeah. Post-traumatic stress syndrome. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, from his last duel.
PTSD. I'm
right.
sorry.
It's okay. At least you said it out loud.
I realized that, wait a minute, that wasn't right.
It's okay. You got all the letters.
Yes. It's not in the right order. But yeah, so I thought this was really interesting. I mean, again,
but you're right? He's. I think you're completely correct. Is that he is recalling the duel that he had with Ajax? That again, he was basically only saved because of Apollo. And if I recall correctly, Ajax had no divine assistance.
Ajax did not. Also, the sun was setting.
Oh yeah, that was your favorite part, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the sun has set. Everyone quit fighting.
Yeah.
So it's actually
in another book coming up that it actually doesn't matter if the sun is up or not.
Right. So, and then basically what ends up happening is that Zeus has to force Ajax to retreat, which is kind of a testament, I think, to Ajax. Yeah. And it's actually kind of a stair-step retreat. Right, he doesn't just full bore run. He stops, he fights, he stops, he fights.
Right. Yeah.
Even around like 700 or so, it says, giant Ajax now, the fighter turned his heels and took his stand once he reached the wedge of the Argive comrade. So once he kind of And so it says also they fought like a mass of swirling fire.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, here he is like really leading a counter offensive against a Zeus blessed, push by Hector. So the narrative now shifts. We get a shift in the narrative to Achilles, and excuse me. So Achilles, again, is watching the onslaught. He's watching his countrymen be slaughtered. He's now seen like all these people have fallen, and he sees particularly Nestor, coming back with someone, right? And so he sees his retreat, and now he thinks, right, hey, I actually think now's the time that my fellow countrymen will grovel at my knees.
Just completely unlikable here.
I know, our Achaean comrades begging for their lives. So again, as we kind of track, like, who's the protagonist, like, who's the hero, like, what is the question? Achilles, I mean, his rage burns in his heart, and it is just him. He's focused on him.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he sends Patroclus, his attendant and great friend, to go ask Nestor, like, hey, what should we do? So Patroclus obeys. So he goes to, Nestor's tent, and we get a few things worth pointing out here. One is 751. Nestor is drinking from a glass, right? This cup. Probably cup's a better word than glass. An average man would strain to lift it off the table when it was full, but Nestor, old as he was, could hoist it up with ease.
Yeah.
What did you take? I mean, what did you take from that?
So, Nestor's always known, he keeps recalling about how the old men were much stronger than the men of today's world. So you kind of assumed that he was going to be strong. But then also it's like, okay, well, if this is the case, apparently he's still in good shape. Apparently he can still, do things that average men can't. Why is he not on the battlefield? And then later on in the book, I don't know exactly where, but I remember reading... and we'll probably get there. But then he uses basically his age again to bow out.
Right.
And so I was just like, I don't know. Like, this is the first time I was kind of like, Nestor, what's going on here? Like, why? I don't know. I didn't like it. I didn't like this part.
So, no, I think you've brought up some really good contrasts, right? So one, Nestor is that link to a prior age, right, where men were stronger. And this is, I think, maybe one of the first times we actually see that Nestor himself, like we've gotten a lot of narratives that Nestor in his prime was better than everybody. Right. But I think this is one of the first times, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have seen Nestor demonstrate like his strength is greater than most average man. But you're right that then, I think you and I were talking offline, it kind of dawned on me that I'm not sure we've had a single narrative of Nestor fighting.
Right.
Like, I don't think we've had a single story. I mean, granted, we have a lot of stories from Nestor. We have story time with Nestor comes in pretty heavily here in a minute. But so it did. No, I think it brings up a few questions that I think are worth answering about Nestor and who he is and why is he not fighting and how is he, if he's stronger than everyone else, or
so
not.
We're just talking about a cup.
Yeah, so I mean, this is some massive, heavy bronze, whatever cup
that an average man would strain to lift it off the table.
Yeah, could hoist it up with ease. So
I don't know. I didn't like it. It was the first time I had a bad taste in my mouth about Nestor.
Well,
but I still have a heart for him. But I just thought.
Well, let's see if that survives the rest of the book because he kind of, I'm not sure if he gives great advice here. So, Patroclus, he tells him, so Nestor tells Patroclus, like, the person I brought in was, Machaon, the healer. And then Patroclus has a really fascinating response. This is at like 775. He's talking about Achilles. He says, well, the old soldier loved by the gods, what sort of man he is, the great and terrible man, why he'd leap to accuse a friend without fault. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is
his dear friend.
This is the great friend Patroclus.
Loved by the gods.
We need to note this because I think this book gives us an insight into Patroclus that I'm not sure I quite grasped the first time I read this. And this time I read it, I feel like it really put a piece in the narrative that helped me make sense of the narrative as a whole. Mm-hmm. So, it's an interesting phrase from Patroclus, so let's flag that. Okay, so then we get into story time with Nestor, and he goes through this whole story of how amazing he was in the olden days. There's a few things to note, I guess. One was he apparently he had 12 sons who were the noble. So he had 11 brothers, and they were all slaughtered by Heracles or Hercules. Mm-hmm. So apparently Nestor's brothers were all slaughtered by Heracles. So that was just notable to me.
Also, here it is. I knew I couldn't find it at first, but like 792 or 7, Nestor says, "And I, what good am I? My limbs are gnarled now. The old power's gone." And it's like, wait a minute. You just said less than a page ago.
Oh, I see.
You were lifting a cup off the table that grown men would strain to lift.
Yeah, so how could we make sense of this? Like, I think that the one that immediately pops in my head is that Nestor is weakened and withered compared to what young Nestor was. So he seems himself like that. But then, as you point out, old Nestor is still stronger than the average Achaean.
Right.
But he does seem to refrain from warfare.
Yeah, as soon as there's a call to battles, he bows out quickly, like as far as for fighting purposes.
Yeah,
I don't know. I didn't like that.
It's an interesting juxtaposition. So he tells this whole story. Athena's involved. I'm pretty sure at 890 he just casually mentions that he killed 100 people. Right. I mean, this is kind of how do you take this? Is this the old man story of I used to have to walk to school uphill in the snow every day? He ends it too with this kind of questionable phrase, right? So such was I in the ranks of men, or was it all a dream?
It's like, all right, are you losing your memory too here, bud? Like, what's going on? Like,
a lot of times, particularly for first-time readers, Nestor really tests their patience, right? Because like the narrative's moving along, and all of a sudden, like, okay, now I have to read this like flashback about how awesome you were,
right?
But let's look at. He does give another flashback here that I think is very much worth paying attention to. So Nestor actually reveals to us that he was part of the contingency that went to the house of Peleus to recruit Achilles for the war. So this is at like 910. And what's really interesting is you look around like 930 or so, this is Nestor talking to Patroclus in this flashback. He says, "And your fathers filled your ears with marching orders, the old horseman Peleus urging his son Achilles, now always be the best, my boy, the bravest, and hold your head up high above the others." Does that sound familiar to you at all? Let me look at the guide so I can make sure that I mention this correctly. That's not the first time we've heard that phrase. So if you remember, this was actually the same phrase that was used in the story of Glaucus when he was talking about that he's related to Bellerophon. And this is the same advice that Glaucus gives his father, except it lacks the third exhortation to never disgrace the generation of your fathers. And I just really took a moment here to really understand, is Homer inviting a comparison here that could lead to some type of discussion? That this is the exact same father to son advice that we've seen before, except the one giving to Achilles does not include never disgrace the generation of your fathers, which is actually pretty similar to what Ajax accused him of doing, right? Like respect your house. So I think there's some discussion there whether Homer is intentionally asking us to compare those two texts. The other thing too about this is then Nestor then mentions what Peleus told Patroclus. So this is Nestor talking about when he was in the house of Peleus, what Peleus told Patroclus about going off to war. And he says, "My child, Achilles is nobler than you, is nobler than you with his immortal blood. but you are older. He has more power than you by far, but give him sound advice, guide him even in battle. Achilles will listen to you for his own good. So here we are revealed that Patroclus is not only the attendant, but is actually supposed to be the counselor to Achilles, and that Achilles will listen to him. Keep in mind that Peleus' father, if you remember back when the embassy went to him, Peleus' father knows that Achilles has a rage problem.
Mm-hmm.
And here he is giving Patroclus as the attendant. And my question is, this whole story is about the rage of Achilles. We keep having the embassy come. We've had the rage at the beginning with Agamemnon. We've had pretty much 15 bad decisions by Achilles stacked on top of one another about, I'm going to let you guys all get slaughtered. I'm not going to enter this. Have we have any evidence at all so far in the Homeric text that Patroclus is fulfilling his role as the advisor to Achilles?
Right. Yeah, I actually marked in here, it may have been during our book study, but I said, did Patroclus fail in his role here?
Yeah, and I think that's the question.
Right.
And that's the piece of the puzzle that I don't think I quite got the first time I read through. And this time, man, as soon as that clicked, it was like a siren. Because I think...
again, this is probably just because of the movie, but when it said that you were older, I always envisioned Patroclus being younger.
Right.
Also, just because of being a servant of Achilles, right? So you just assume that he is the younger protege of Achilles.
So I think you're correct. I think that now we're invited by Homer to say, wait, has Patroclus failed in his mission as part of the antagonisms between Agamemnon and Achilles due to the failure of Patroclus to carry out what he was asked to do by Peleus? Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think this is the position of Nestor, because Nestor ends his statement, so the old man told you, you've forgotten, right? Mm-hmm. You're not doing what you need to be doing. You have forgotten this. So in that sense, Nestor is great. In this sense, Nestor then gives some advice that will change the entire war, right? So at 950, basically Achilles does need to come back and fight, but at least let Achilles send Patroclus into battle. Let the whole Myrmidon army follow your command. Remember, that's the tribe that Achilles commands. Mm-hmm. You might bring some light of victory of our Argives, right? So he actually says, like, listen, you need to wear his. You even need wear his armor, mm-hmm. right? You actually really need to pretend to be him and just come out and fight, right? That's what you need to do at least. And Patroclus really, my read of this is that he really lets this sink into him. He leaves, and then he kind of has this lament, right? He kind of stands back and looks at the situation as a whole and says, it's like a 975, poor men, Lord of the Argives, O my captains, how doomed you are. Look far from your loved ones in native land, right? He leaves Nestor, and all of a sudden he's seeing almost like the scales have fallen from his eyes, the mm-hmm. situation they're in. And maybe Nestor's even called him back to, like, what is your role, right? And it ends with kind of an interesting ending that maybe an insight into his character. I'm open for suggestions. That basically he runs into an injured Achaean, right, that's been hit by arrows, and saying, hey, save me, use your healing power. Mm-hmm. And Patroclus at first is like, well, I've got to go take a message to Achilles. And then he says, well, you know what? I know I won't neglect you, even with such a wound. And then the book ends with this kind of fraternal moment of Patroclus taking care of one of his fellow soldiers.
I didn't really know what to think. To be honest with you, when I read through this, there was a lot of things that go into my head, and I wasn't really sure exactly what to think about all of this, like how to digest all of mm-hmm. this. And at first I was thinking, like, well, is Nestor actually doing this on purpose? Is he trying? Is he realizing that if he stokes Patroclus and plants seeds into Patroclus's head, mm-hmm. this is how he's going to be able to get Achilles to get into the war, to move Achilles? And then I was like, well, then with Patroclus being older and supposed to be the kind of the one giving advice, the counselor of Achilles,
right?
If Patroclus is supposed to be the wiser one, the one who uses reason, well, then why is Nestor trying to fool Patroclus? Like, that just seems like that's kind of an uphill battle. Like, it seems like there's a more low hanging fruit than this.
I mean, I just took it as Nestor not trying to like trick anyone per se, but giving advice and, kind of and maybe poor advice, but just saying, hey, like, at least do this, right? At least like if Achilles can't fight, do this. But I think that overall, like if you're saying, hey, what do I take away from this book? Like what's one of the things I really need to take away from? I really think the insight into Patroclus is important, right? That Patroclus had a role to play, and all of a sudden, almost halfway through the book, we realize like, oh, you're supposed to be advising Achilles.
Right. You're the older dude.
And you are not doing your role. And like, there's a question here of, how much do we want to blame Patroclus then for like the current situation?
But in all fairness to Patroclus, Achilles has not shown that he takes counsel all that great.
No. And I mean, I think that if you're going to give a defense of Patroclus, I'd point to his prior statement of the fact that he understands that Achilles is a man that would leap to blame a friend without fault.
Right.
So he might know that, hey, even if I come out and say this, there's a great chance that Achilles could slaughter me or throw me out of the camp or exile me.
Right.
But then the question is like, well, you got to,
what's your role?
Yeah, do your job.
Right.
Right. So anyway, that's our life advice.
Next week is book 12.
We're halfway through.
And
that's, what is that, a quarter of the way through the year of Homer?
Look at that.
I know, this is amazing.
I wonder how many people have stuck around to this point.
A lot, I think. A lot. I think it's
It is good to hear from people. It's good to hear from people. Like we're getting more and more feedback on reading with Homer, and wanting the desire to do that. I mean, it's interesting.
Starting small groups.
It
right.
seems like
having good conversations.
Yeah, every couple of weeks, it seems like that people are reaching out, wanting to know how to start. And again, I think the best way, go check out our website.
Right.
Go to thegreatbookspodcast.com. You can find out some of the notes. I mean, you work really hard on these notes, and they're really good. And I highly recommend people at least going through, if this is your first time, even if it's not your first time to read, it's worth looking through, because as we learn in the great books, that you continually learn more and more as you read through them over and over and over again, become more familiar with them.
And there's layers and a lot of things that I think you missed the first time that you read through. And also a lot of things that like it's nice to read them in a group, because, iron sharpens iron and people have different insights.
Right.
And I think this is good. I mean, I think the year of Homer is very fruitful. We're halfway through. Next time, I think we're going to try to invite actually some of the guys from our small group.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, maybe we'll never do that again. But we'll invite some of the guys from our small group, maybe to, I think, some first-time readers.
Right.
Just say, hey, like, discuss book 12, and then say, like, hey, overall, like, how are you feeling about the text? Like, who do you think the protagonist is? What perennial truths are sticking out to you? What do you think about some of the major themes we're tracking? We're tracking, what would be some of them? We're looking at the character of Odysseus. What do we think of him? We're looking at some of the nature of Athena and how is that reflected in the kind of Diomedes and Odysseus. We're looking at fate. Mm-hmm. We're looking at how does that correspond with the will of Zeus? Is that just like his alter ego? Is the nameless fate actually something that actually is forcing everyone? The human sensitivity to the divine, those that can see the gods, those that understand the God's voice. There's just a lot of themes here that I think you might say, well, these aren't very philosophical. It's not a very philosophical text. Mm-hmm. But really you have to realize like this is like the initial churning of the soil, right? This is like where everything is kind of in a nascent stage that's then going to start leading the Greeks to start asking questions. And then this is going to provide, obviously we've got to work through the Odyssey, but then, Homer is going to be the guidepost for all of these plays, all of this poetic, artistic expressions in Greek Hellenized culture. And then it's inside that context that you're going to get Socrates, Plato, Aristotle really starting to ask a lot of these questions. And then that culture leads heavily then into kind of merging or intermixing, if you will, with Hebrew culture is what actually truly then tills the soil for the coming of Jesus Christ, right? So this is just like you would start if you said, hey, I want to understand Hebrew culture. Where do I start? You start with Genesis. If you understand Greek culture, you start with Homer.
Yeah. Well, one of the best things you could do is share this podcast with your friends, family members, those who you may want to start a small group with, and follow us with this year of Homer and enjoy the Iliad with us, and let us know what your thoughts are. Reach out to us, keep us up to date on how the small groups are going. We'll have a little treat, like we said, next week with a few other people, and until then, We'll see you next week.
See you.